Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you guys doing? And welcome to the second episode where we're exploring ideologies. Ideologies which are most important, foundational and influential, both on Western discourses and on Eastern discourses. Today, inshallah, we're going to continue with the poem, and we're going to be speaking about materialism, naturalism, physicalism. We're going to be demarcating between these kinds of things. We're going to be talking about the hard problem of consciousness. We're going to be talking about AI and how individuals can be differentiated, human beings can be differentiated from robots, if at all. Can they be differentiated from robots? These kinds of questions and more will feature in today's discussion. But before we do so, of course, we're going to read parts of the poem.
فصل الماديين وانقسمت معاشر الملاحدة لفرق عن الطريق حائدة فمنهم من بالمواد يعتقد لما يحس والوجود يعتمد ورد هذا المذهب المغفل بأن أشياء لنا لم تجهل واعترفوا بها وما حس درى ولم تكن أعينهم لها ترى مثاله الأرقام والأخلاق فعلمها بالحس لا يطاق فليس يمكن لمادي بأن يعلم بالشر وخيرنا الحسن فكيف يثبتون سوء قتل طفل على ما قد فني بأكل فليصمتوا عن الحديث في الخلق لأنه غيب ومن قلبا يشق أما بنو الإسلام طرا أسلموا أمرهم لله فهو أعلم فما يراه طيبا يطاب وما يراه خبثا يعاب حقا لهم بذلك اعتزاز لأن نهجهم له امتياز لأنهم متصلون بالأحد بكل شيء عالم مضى وجد ويعلم الجزئية والكلية سبحانه ويعلم الحتمية.
So this, the Sheikh, and we'll go into further detail in the Arabic session inshallah ta'ala, but the Sheikh basically speaks about, first he speaks about epistemologically what materialists say, and we'll demarcate as aforementioned what materialism is and what naturalism is and physicalism, if there are differences between them, if these words can be used interchangeably and so on. And so the epistemological basis, and then he moves on to kind of prescriptive morality. And can a materialist now have a basis for morality? Objective, prescriptive morality. And of course, we've spoken about this if you guys are familiar with our works at length, and this is one of the major points, I think, talking points between kind of theists and non-theists or atheists or whatever it may be. But we'll touch upon this again today. We'll start, inshallah ta'ala, with some demarcations on definitions. So materialism and physicalism are usually used interchangeably, okay? Whereas naturalism sometimes is not. Now, what is a robust definition of materialism and or physicalism? So, physicalism implies that reality is necessitated by or supervenes on the physical. Okay, this is kind of the thesis that no non-physical ingredients are needed to account for anything in the actual world. The physical ingredients alone suffice. Tai says this, 2009, in his book, page 25. What does this mean? Basically, materialists don't say that there's no supernatural in the world. Everything that is in the world can be explained by physical processes alone. They did not require reference to or kind of superfluous, they would say, in their understanding, reference to supernatural forces, God, angels, spirits, or anything like that. So as we say, materialism says this. Physicalism is very similar to this, if not interchangeable in its usage. However, David Papanua, who is a philosopher of mind in King's College, London, he differentiates in his book, which is referred to as philosophical naturalism. He's got a book called Philosophical Naturalism. And he differentiates between what he refers to as ontological naturalism and methodological naturalism. He differentiates between those two things. So ontological naturalism, or even metaphysical naturalism, is a claim about the world that actually, as we've read here, very similar to the materialist discourse, that nothing which is non-physical can supervene or interfere or affect physical processes. In fact, these are superfluous things that themselves are not substantiated, really. Whereas methodological naturalism is more to do with the method. It's more to do when you're doing science now. when we start doing science, the scientific method, okay, or even he calls it this philosophical method, and don't forget that science, as it's referred to now, was referred to back in the day, maybe in the 15th century, 14th century, it was referred to before the scientific revolution as natural philosophy. It's a very interesting point. That science itself was referred to as natural philosophy until probably about the 16th century when the scientific revolution took place. That's what they're referring to it in the biggest universities in this country. They're referring to it as natural philosophy. But anyway, putting that to the side, when it comes to natural philosophy, or when it comes to science in general, there should be no starting points which presuppose, for example, the existence of a God, or presuppose anything a priori, in fact. The idea should be that we start with empirical, kind of methodological approach, which references only the physical world around us. So there is a demarcation that is made now between methodological naturalism and ontological or metaphysical naturalism. The former, of course, being that you don't necessarily have to be committed to the latter in order to be. In other words, you don't have to be a metaphysical ontological naturalist in order to do science using the methodological naturalistic approach. You don't have to believe that there's no God in order for you to do science without reference to God. I mean, so that's why the differentiation is there. And by the way, it's a very important differentiation, okay? Because especially in new atheist literature, you'll find that these categories are oftentimes conflated. Oftentimes, these categories are conflated. I'll give you one clear example of this. John Lennox, when he had his debate with Richard Dawkins, actually. John Lennox had a debate with Richard Dawkins, and he was talking about evolution as explaining the complexity in the biological dimension, right? So the reason why there's so much complexity in the biological dimension is because of what? Because of evolution. You say, because it started off very simple and then it just got more and more complex, and this is how we understand it. John Lennox made a very good point. He said, what you're doing is you're making a category mistake fallacy. There's a difference between agency. There's a difference between mechanism and agency. Okay, there's a difference between mechanism and agency. And connected to this is this idea of methodological naturalism, which we have to employ in order to understand the mechanism. And a priori claims or ontological claims about how that mechanism is operating the way it is operating. So let me put this in another way. For example, if I say, I drive a car to get to this place. I drove my car to get from point A to point B, yeah? Okay, how do you describe this? You describe this, the car went from point A to point B. And we can describe the mechanics of it, what happened in the car, what happened in the wheels, what happened in the catalytic converter, I don't know, whatever it is. You guys may be mechanics of the car, you don't know more than I do in this situation. But you can describe the mechanics of it, right? Now, the agency is me. I am the agent that's causing the car to drive. Now, when, for example, they make this category mistake, what they're saying is evolutionary biology is itself. It's almost as if they're saying it is itself the agent. Because the claim of the new atheist is that any reference to agency is superfluous, it's unneeded, it's frivolous, it's unrequired, it's unneeded, it's unnecessary. But you see, if you know the categories well, and this is what we're doing here, if you know the categories well, you'll realize that they are confusing the categories. John Lennox in that debate, he understood the differences between mechanism and agency, the difference between methodological naturalism and ontological metaphysical naturalism, and therefore he could stop the new atheist in his track because he was conflating the categories. You separate them back to where they need to be in separation. And this is not something which lay people are doing. As I say, you know, people that are even, I mean, Papa Newell himself is a materialist, for all from reading his works and kind of listening to his talks. You can see he's a materialist, but he admits the differentiation between these two things. Now itself, materialism is kind of broken down into different types. So we talked about these terms. I'll just break it down again. We said these terms you'll hear a lot of the time. Naturalism, and all naturalists are atheists. You cannot have a naturalist that's not an atheist, but unless he's a methodological naturalist, of course. What we're talking about, an ontological naturalist, or a metaphysical naturalist, or a philosophical naturalist, that person is an atheist because he's saying everything is physical. There's nothing that is supernatural. He's denying the supernatural. You cannot be an ontological naturalist and be a theist. How? When you've already denied the supernatural in your starting point. So by telling you he's a naturalist, he's basically telling you, if he is telling you that he is an ontological naturalist, that he is an atheist as well. As I say, materialism and physicalism, they use interchangeably. And once again, in the philosophy of the mind discourse, pretty much the same thing. which that processes, physical processes, are explained physically. They're not explained with reference to anything else. And so this is divided into different types. So you have eliminative materialism. That's one so you've got materialism, and then you have, underneath it, you have eliminative materialism. And as in the name, it eliminates everything except for that which is material, if you like. So we eliminate all possibilities of something which is supernatural, except for that which is material. And what David Chalmers says, let me get exact quotes because this might be But he talks about first-person subjective experiences. Like, for example, and we'll come to this, the hard problem of consciousness. How do you, first-person subjective experience, how do you define? And he says this is something that we will know, because the neurological framework of the we don't know it now, but we're going to come to understand, how neurology works. And any reference to first-person subjective is just folk psychology, he calls it, really. It's just folk psychology. It's not something which is to be taken seriously. So he eliminates every other possibility except for the material possibility. And so too, of course, do other eliminative materialists. I mean, Chambers himself, I think he actually coined the term hard problem of consciousness. It's a quite interesting point to note. But just to give you another thing here, which is, we'll come to the hard problem of consciousness. In fact, I won't mention this now. I'll mention it when we're talking about the hard problem in more detail. Reductive materialism. Okay, so reductive materialism asserts that there is a knowledge gap between physical processes and subjective consciousness. So they will admit that which the eliminative materialist is not admitting, which is that there is some kind of a gap here that exists between our consciousness and subjective experiences. But they will maintain that this gap is explained with a physicalist philosophy. They'll say that still yet it's something to do with neurology. So once again, they're very similar to eliminative materialists, extremely similar. They're just making a little bit more of a concession. Okay. And functionalists, and by the way, this term is going to come up over and over and over again. And beware that one term comes up, like the word ontology. It comes up so many times in philosophy, but has different meanings in every sub-compartment of philosophy. So if we talk about philosophy of religion, it has one meaning. If we are talking about ontological and deontological ethics in the philosophy of ethics, it has a completely different meaning. Completely different. So the word ontology, you've got to be careful because it's a slippery fish. Depending on where we are, what context we're talking about, it means a completely different thing. Likewise, the word functionalism, structuralism. What are we talking about? Sociological functionalism? No. Here, we're talking about functionalism in the, if you know, philosophy of the mind, or we're talking about functionalism in materialism, it's different. It's basically saying that physical processes explain the functions. Every function is explained through physical processes. So once again, everything material goes back to these two words, physical processes. Everything is physical processes. In fact, everything can be described through physical processes. And another one is emergent materialism. Emergent materialism tells you actually that consciousness emerges through the word because of materialism. It emerges. I mean, once again, they're just pushing the question back. How does it emerge? We don't know it. We're going to find out. Don't worry. But it does emerge through the material experiences. Now, I think at this point we should talk a little bit about something else before I get to the hard problem and these kinds of big topics, right? But before I do so, let's summarize. Someone, can you summarize for me what are the keywords? Because there's going to be we've got a lot of keywords here. Yeah? There's going to be a lot more keywords that we're going to go over. A lot more keywords that we're going to go over. So I want to be sure that everyone's following. What does materialism mean? Okay, physical processes matter. Great. Is there really a difference between physicalism and materialism? Yeah, so they're used interchangeably. Yeah. Or naturalism is divided into two different things. Who remembers what they are? For extra points, who is one of the people that was responsible for this distinction? David Papanua. Right, okay, great. It's even better. All right, no problem. Give me three types of materialism. Yeah, great. And you're going to have to go and do more research, because if I was to go into detail about each and every single one of those, this will be a 3-hour, session. We've got a lot to get. This is superficial. Right? Everything now is superficial, right? Now, I want to quickly divert to something important. And please, if anyone gets lost, just put your hand up, tell me, and then I'll repeat myself, okay? But there is something called positivism, which took prominence in the 20s in Vienna, Berlin Circle, the Vienna Circle, in UK, in Britain, in parts of Europe. Logical positivism, which depended on something called the principle of verification. Okay, has anyone heard of this before or acquainted with this? Yeah. Any statement which cannot be verified empirically is meaningless. This is what they were saying. Now, like any school of thought, there's weaker claims and stronger claims here. So the positivists there were people that were making this claim in a stronger way, like absolutely. And then when the contradictions started to pop up, they started weakening the claims. Okay, people that are associated with this kind of school of thought are Bertrand Russell, of course. Yeah, Wittgenstein, who wrote Tractatus, or at least in his earlier years. Okay, you have lots of Frege. You can do a list of people who are associated, big heavyweights that were associated with this movement. Okay, and so what is really the difference between a logical positivist and an empiricist? There's a limited difference, a very limited difference. Okay, an empiricist doesn't necessarily have to subscribe to the theory of verificationism. Okay, verification. Remember one more time. Verification says if you cannot empirically justify it, it's not true or false. It's meaningless. That's what they were saying. It's meaningless. Now, this school of thought, which as we say, took place, started off A.J. Ayer in his book Logic, Truth, and it's a very famous book. One of the main books that you have to read in philosophy kind of modules and stuff. A.J. Ayer. You can see him, by the way, speaking on YouTube and stuff. You can watch. But anyway, that school of thought started to get battered. Like a proper battery from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Why? Because so many things that were scientific in nature or that were needed in order for science to take place, they were being rejected because they don't fit that criterion.
What's it called? Logical?
So the thing is called logical positivism. Okay.
So basically they're saying anything that is not measured out with 5 senses is rejected.
Is meaningless.
Meaningless. So then what about testimony?
See, the testimony, they would reduce it. They'd have a way to squabble away from testimony. They would reduce it, say, well, testimony, you listen to that, we can still verify what this person is talking about. So they'll have a way of weaseling out of testimony, but there are stronger cases here. What do you think?
What about the statement itself?
Pardon?
The statement itself.
Right, okay, very, very famously, this statement is self-refuting, right? Mm-hmm. So if you say anything that cannot be verified empirically is meaningless, that statement itself cannot be verified empirically. So it's like a suicide bomb, not the ones that these people are used to, an intellectual suicide. Because the statement is, but not just that, you have lots of things. The scientific method itself is a priori understood. We talked about the difference between a priori and a posteriori. A priori meaning, something which is received before or understood before even the empirical kind of exposure, if you like. Something you know before, like mathematics or whatever. And so it took such a battering that many of them actually rejected it afterwards. This was one of the things, was really, in 30 years, one of the defeated schools of thought. It is seen as defeat. Just in your own time, look at A.J. Ayer, who is seen as one of the big names of this movement. And he's having, I think, a discussion with Hilary Putnam or one of the other philosophers. You can find it online, and he actually admits how they all had to change their minds on it. Because it's just untenable to have this, this theory that everything. There's so much in science. theoretical aspects. The laws of nature. How can you make reference to the laws of nature? Because the laws of nature are not something which empirically you can see. They're a transcendental universal category, which we're talking about how the universe works in pattern A or pattern B. That's not necessarily something that the way in theoretical science will go under the bus. And because theoretical science will go under the bus, a lot of the things, the theories that they are taking, even general theory of relativity and there's assumptions, because all these theories have assumptions, that will go under the bus as well. You cannot do theoretical science with this kind of thing. And so they had to change it, and some of them just left it, and so on. And now it's not as popular at all, logical positivism. But it's not the same as materialism, but I think it's important that you know what it is, and that you know the history of that thing, because from the 20s to the 50s, there's been such a revolution in thought in terms of the history of that thing, that it's important that we're aware. Because once again, polemically, if someone comes to you and says, well, I don't believe in, X, Y, Z, I don't believe that anything you can't measure is anything that you can't measure or verify empirically is meaningless. If someone comes with that, you say, well, actually, this has already been said and dealt with in philosophy. It's been dealt with in the philosophy of language and mind and science, philosophy of science and philosophy of maths. All of that has been dealt with. So bear that in mind. So that's another key word here. Logical positivism. Connected to it is empiricism, which we said is very close, but not the same. Okay. These isms. Okay, we've covered so much today. For fear of losing you guys, are important to know.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, can you just logical positivism?
Yes.
Can you give examples in the scientific method that you say contradicts that anything that can't be measured is meaningless? What methods in science do they use that cannot be measured? Because I thought science
the verification. So the scientific method is presupposed by science. It's not discovered by it. This is very important. Okay, that's ijma' on the philosophers of science, consensus among philosophers of science. The scientific method is something which is an assumption of science. It's not something which is discoverable by it. Meaning, in history, in kind of history, all the way back to Aristotle, there were ways in which, okay, how do you find out, or what is the method, what is the way that you find out what is true naturalistically and what isn't true naturalistically? Obviously, it's underwent development through the Middle Ages. Ibn Haytham, the optician, but the specialist in optics and so on in the Muslim world, and then Francis Bacon, and then the scientific revolution, all the way through to Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn and these guys that, for example, the principle of verification. This principle itself was meant to facilitate science. So if something is not empirically justified, it's meaningless. Karl Popper came along in 1904. He died, and he said, actually, it's not like this. It's something. It's called falsification, right? It's that which is falsifiable is that which is rigorous from a scientific perspective, acceptable from a scientific perspective. It doesn't mean it's incorrigible, but you have to put something in place which can be falsified. So your theory must be falsifiable. You must be able to falsify it. You must be able to disprove it. It must be susceptible to falsification. If it's not, it's not scientifically rigorous. This is Karl Popper. The idea, like you mentioned, right, of verification or falsification, those two ideas themselves are not physical ideas. They're not physical ideas. So you can't put them under a microscope. You can't discover them with your five senses. They are in the mind. They are logical ideas. They are not physical. Can you put the postulation, the predicate, whatever you want to call it, that which is not empirically justified is meaningless. You can't put that statement under a microscope. You can't prove that statement.
Do you mean like messy emotions like love? Does that fall under that as well?
You can't put that under a microscope either.
So can we use that as an argument?
Yeah, you can use that. This is the argument which we'll come to about.
The concept of love doesn't exist. For example, can we use dark matter?
We can use. I would use all of that with consciousness, not with this debate. With this debate, there are more strong examples, because with love and all these kind of things, they'll say, "Look, it's neurological firings." Okay, remember they're going to say this.
What consciousness?
No, consciousness will come to in a second.
With love, but that's just waves.
Yeah, but we'll come to this in a second. But with the logical positivists, let them see the counter examples. Because why did they? First of all, show them that historically, that when these counter examples were presented, that they softened their position and they abandoned it. That's what happened. Okay, their main guys, imagine abandoning their position. Forget about these lay people, the huge, the mu'assisin, the foundation, the founding fathers of this. They abandoned this thing. or at least they soften their position very majorly. Then, so present those counterexamples. For example, the scientific method, logical inquiry, theory within science, all of those things which are a priori, which are in the mind. They're not physically, you cannot verify them with a microscope, with a telescope, with any scientific investigation. They are themselves not tappable by the method that they are construing for the science. They cannot be tapped by that method. So when you present those counterexamples, it's effective. But let's go back to so we've spoken about this now. So you've got logical positivists, we have material. They're not all the same thing. Usually they are. I mean, you'll find someone who is a logical positivist, usually is a materialist, and he probably is an ontological naturalist. But it's conceivable that someone isn't those things. So don't bunch them together. You must be able to separate those things just in case, because you have to be very precise when you're discussing with people. What is your position? If someone says, I'm a materialist, well, then you start speaking to them as if they're a physicalist, or if they're a methodological naturalist, and you start speaking to them as if they're an ontological naturalist, then you're going to have mistakes in your own polemic. Because the materialist doesn't make the claim that the principle of verification is required in order for science to be science, or something to be meaningful. That claim is not made. Yeah, that's a similarity. But remember, the principle of verification itself is non-material. So the materialist is not committed to that. He's not committed to the principle of verification. He could say, look, I'm committed to the Karl Popper's principle of falsification, which is completely different. So why would you lump me with the logical positivists? You see, so you've got to be very careful with these demarcations here. All right, so move on to the hard problem of consciousness. And David Chalmers, we talked about him. He's the one who coined the term, I think, the hard problem of consciousness. Why is it a hard problem? How do we get, this is the question, right? How do we get from brain activity to consciousness? Okay, brain activity, neurons and whatever, to consciousness. Do we get even from brain activity to consciousness? Do we even get from A to B like that? So the materialists would argue that they are one and the same thing. You're talking about the same thing. Brain activity is consciousness, and consciousness is brain activity. But of course, if the materialist says that, and by the way, Papanua says that, he, in his defense, because he's a materialist, he says this, he says, you asking how do we get from brain activity to consciousness is like saying, how do we get from H2O to water? It's the same thing. You're talking about the same thing, and it's tautological almost, right? But this is begging the question, actually. If he says that, he's begging the question. It's a circular argument. You're assuming materialism to prove it, to prove materialism. Of course, Papanua, and he does say this. If you don't say this, and you say there is a difference between brain activity and consciousness, then you're assuming what you call a dualism. So we'll take one step back here now, and there are three schools of thought in what we call substance theory. Okay, substance theory. You have substance theory, and then you have three schools of thought. You have materialism, which we've kind of discussed. Everything is physical. So, yeah. Then you have another theory which is in the Western tradition promulgated by René Descartes, which is called dualism. Dualism. Dualism is basically the idea that the mind and body are separate. This is the idea. Why did Descartes, we spoke about Descartes a little bit last lesson, but why did Descartes come to the idea that the mind and the body are two separate things? So what it was with Descartes is that, look, he wrote a book called The Meditations. It's very similar to Al-Ghazali, by the way. It's almost a copy and paste. I think he copied and pasted it, yeah? But he basically said, look, how do I know I'm here? And but I'm seeing my hand, but is this really my hand? How about my vision is impaired? How about if there's some demon out there? He literally talks about a demon, by the way. He says, what about if there's some demon that's making me hallucinate? How do I know this? And he kept asking this, it's called systematic doubt. He's doubting everything. And then at the end of it, he comes to cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And this is called the cogito. I think, he says, therefore I am. He says, I can doubt everything in the world. But there's one thing I can't doubt, he says. I can't doubt that I'm thinking right now. Has anyone, let me ask a question, personal question. Has anyone ever hallucinated before? Yeah? You have, haven't you? Have you ever? It's really uncomfortable experience. I've had it, unfortunately. You know, hallucination and stuff like that. And you can have a disembodied experience, like your body is out. You don't know who you are. Like, you know, it's very odd. You know, who am I? But in that situation, and I'm sure there's people that take psychedelics and LSD and all this kind of things. They know it. They're shaking. They're nodding their head. You know? See, I see. You know what I'm talking about. Mushrooms and hallucinogens and stuff like that. They take it, and they might not even know what they're thinking what's going on. But one thing that they do know is that they exist. Yani, for someone to have a conversation with you, they must know they exist. Any conversation presupposes existence. And we said that that's the most foundational thing in the world. And in fact, what René Descartes said, well, he thought he was stripping away all the doubts. And he said, I think, therefore I am. It was criticized by Nietzsche. Remember, he said that actually. Nietzsche said what? Do you remember? He said, how do you... Yeah, he said, presupposing the I. So how do you know that you exist? How do you know? So Avicenna, who came before him in timeline, he said, look, there's no doubt that there is existence. He went one step further than him. He said, look, I'm not going to say I think, therefore I am. This was before René Descartes. He says, there's no doubt that there is existence. La shak. There's no doubt there is existence. That's one thing that you cannot doubt. And if anyone says that there is doubt, them doubting existence is itself an affirmation of it. This is one thing that's so foundational, by the way. But because René Descartes came to that conclusion that, look, I think, therefore I am, he said, but I came to the conclusion that I think, therefore I am, without reference to what? To my five senses. Without reference to what? To my body. So there must be a separation between the mind and the body. There must be a separation between consciousness and the body. Consciousness and the body. And this is referred to as dualism. So the idea that it's conceivable to separate consciousness from the body.
You believe that?
Muslims certainly don't believe in materialism. Dualism, some Muslims believe that. I mean, Ghazali is probably a dualist, but this is an issue of controversy. I don't want to comment on it because I've met some scholars that say we don't believe in dualism, but it's a controversial topic. But in substance theory, there are three schools of thought. There's materialism, there's dualism, the idea that consciousness is separate from the body, and the third idea is idealism. Idealism is George Berkeley, where he says everything is basically in the mind. There's nothing. It's the opposite of materialism. See, materialism says everything is in the physical. Idealists say everything is in the mind. They're the complete opposite to materialists. So, for example, we're in a matrix world right now. We're in a matrix world.
Yeah.
How do we, yeah, we could very well be in a matrix world, and this is referred to as solipsism. Solipsism and idealism are two sides of the same coin, you could say. But not necessarily the same thing, by the way. Just once again, to be precise. A solipsist is an idealist, but an idealist is not necessarily a solipsist, to put it more precisely, right? So these are the three theories. So going back to David Papanua, he says that, well, H2O equals water. And so you asking how does brain activity affect consciousness is you asking how does H2O affect water, or how is H2O water? And it's the same thing. You're talking about the same thing twice. He is presupposing what? Materialism. But he says that when we are dividing between the two things, we are presupposing what? Dualism. You see the point? And see, we have an issue here again. You see the issue here? We have an issue here again. You have to presuppose something, don't you? How do you produce a natural or neutral, I should say? How do you produce a neutral assumption before approaching this question? It's very, very difficult. But it doesn't make sense to say, well, actually H2O and water are the same thing. Why doesn't it make sense to say that? There are a range of reasons. One of the first reasons is that consciousness is a first person subjective experience. Now, first person, when I say I, that's what first person. Second person, I say you. Third person, I say he, she, they. That's what first person, I. So when I'm talking about my own experience, I say I feel X. I feel it. I feel anger. Like you were talking about emotions. I feel sadness. I feel I. But science as an enterprise doesn't deal with the first person at all. Science only deals with the third person. It. When we tried this on that, it became this. So how can a third-person enterprise tap into a first-person experience? That is a problem.
And that's the method they use.
Yeah.
How you gonna use that?
They're presupposing a third-person inquiry on a first-person experience. This is a problematic thing to do. When René Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," he didn't say they think, therefore they are.
Therefore I am. They think therefore I am.
Yeah. You can't really do that, right? You can't even assume the existence of other minds. Like the fact that I'm speaking to you right now, how do you know I'm not a robot or some kind of thing? How do you know I have a mind? How do you know that the tree outside has a mind? Why are you assuming just because you have it that it has it? Right? It's a first-person superimposition. So first-person experiences can't be tapped by a third-person thing. That's the first problem. The second problem is this. The second problem...
So science uses third person?
Yeah, science is a third-person enterprise. It's a third-person enterprise. It has to be. In fact, it has to be a third. It is by necessity a third-person enterprise. So they haven't solved anything. My anger, my sadness, my love, all of these things, they cannot be explained through tubes and microscopes. Well, someone will say, Papa Newell himself, I've mentioned him so many times today. Well, we can put them under an MRI scan. Of course, this is something they do nowadays, isn't it? But the problem is if you put them under an MRI scan and then you give them pictures of their loved ones or something, or whatever, like trigger them. And we'll see what part of the brain starts lighting up. He himself admits, in fact, in one of his books, he says that some parts of the brain light up when you give them the trigger. But sometimes the trigger is there and the trigger is there and it lights up, and sometimes it lights up when the trigger is not there. So in other words, how do we know that it's correlation equals causation? Because if A is required for B, in fact he mentions this himself, not in this language, I'm using it in my own language. If A is the inexplicable cause of B, then if A is not present, B should not be present. But B can be present when A is not present. Therefore, A is not the inexplicable cause of B. Put it another way. And this is another argument, a line of argumentation. In fact, Firas Zahabi mentioned this to me. I like to give credit to people when it's due. He's very, very good with the philosophy of mind, and people don't know this guy's quite like on the next level genius when it comes to these things. But he gave me a very good example, and I'm going to use it now in front of you. It's about the ship of Theseus. Maybe he said it publicly, I don't know. But he really good example. If you have a ship, it's made out of planks. Okay. Ship is made out of planks. And I take out each plank and I replace it with a new plank. Do I have a new ship? I have a new ship, materially, don't I? But did you know that each cell of our body gets renewed? So do we have new us each time?
Yeah, and if the consciousness tunes into the brain, and the brain renews...
Yeah, right.
Does that mean...
Yeah, it's a new person.
No, don't even play, that's from me.
Yeah, that's not from me, it's from us. We go, ويحبون أن يحمدوا بما لم يفعل. The Quran says.
And also, for example, you have things talking about some people are born with like half a brain, something, and they're still their selves, if that makes sense. Which we discussed. Can we use that in this? We can kind of use it. Like if we can use it, but let's just stick to this example. Okay. Let's stick to this because it's very clear. If every cell of the body gets rejuvenated, including that which is in the brain, every neuron can be replaced. Which it does.
And if it is, yes it does. And if it is the case that we are what we are materially, so that what we are now and what we are 20 years from now are completely different individuals. Well, yeah. If there's no explicit external conscious element that is outside in the dualist assumption and so on. So that's the second thing. The first thing we said, the first person problem. First person subjective experience. The second thing we said, the replacement of cells and so on, material, or you can call it material replacement. The third thing I'll say, which relates more to the idea of AI. A very interesting argumentation here. They'll say, well, look, can a robot have consciousness? Right? Why can you not put consciousness into some kind of a robot? What would be your reactions to that? So I can say, why can you, a robot? Well, we can give it AI technologies. Robots are programmed, just like we are programmed, and they have binary technology. Everything is loops and conditionals, actually. in computer science. Everything is loops and conditionals. You put it in the mind of the robot if you like, the mind.
Well, it's systematic. A robot cannot make choice decisions.
Remember, determinists will argue the same thing about with human beings. We'll come to determinism in free will and say everything is caused by antecedents, cause of events. We are puppets as well.
No problem. How does that deny the consciousness of us and the robot?
But how do we know that there's consciousness in us and not in
So
robots?
you know the example, okay? Does that prove that that consciousness is not material because we change? Like our whole body becomes a new body.
Yeah, that's an argument against consciousness being material.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah. Oh, I thought you had your hand up there.
Can't you use that for AI then? Because that's a proof that the consciousness is not material. So AI is not material.
Well, let's speak very, very specifically about AI. Okay, if I say to my wife or my mum or my daughter, whatever it may be, if I say I love you or whatever it may be, yeah. If I say any of that, what am I saying? I'm saying 3 words. Okay, I'm saying 3 words. But those 3 words, do they have meaning?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, there is a difference, and I want you guys to write this down. Yeah. There is a difference between syntax and semantics. All right, syntax and semantics. Okay, syntax.
Can you spell that?
S-Y-N-T-A-X and semantics S-E-M-A-N-T-I-C-S.
So S.
S-Y.
S-Y.
Yeah, S-Y-N-T-A-X. Syntax.
Okay.
Yeah, and semantics. Yeah. So syntax is the words you're using. I love you, I hate you, you know, get out of it, whatever you like. Semantics is what you are meaning with those words. Very important distinction here. Syntax is the words that you're using, whereas semantics is what you mean when you say those things. Now, yeah, so let me put the argument in one sentence and explain the argument. It's not my argument, once again, it's by William Haskell, one of the philosophers of mind. The difference between syntax and semantics is that syntax is the words that you're using, and semantics is what you're intending. So the key differential here is what you call intentionality. In what you intend when you say, I love you. When a robot says, I love you, is it the same as when I say, I love you to my daughter? And if I have a robot and it says, I love you to my daughter, is it the same as if I say it? No, because there's a different intentionality there, right? How do you put this formally? You put this formally by saying the following. A robot has an input, and that input is the binary input with conditionals and loops in the computer programming system that it will learn through the inputter, which in this case will be the human being that puts that input inside of it. William Haskell says, from this perspective, a robot is just like a television. In as much as the robot has an output, it's the same as a television having an output of the news or entertainment.
Or like a calculator.
Yeah, or maybe like a calculator, right? Or a robotic parrot of some sort, right? It doesn't really know what it's saying. Or it doesn't intend anything from it. And John Searle has a very famous experiment called the Chinese room experiment. And he basically says if you were in a room and some people gave you some things under the, and says, I love you and so on, and you give it back out and you don't know what it's saying, you don't intend to say any of those things, but you can communicate. So communication is possible without intentionality. And that is what makes the difference between us and a robot, even on a communicative level, right? So we have intentionality. A robot can never have intentionality because it can never formulate that autonomously. It always requires an input, which will have a loop and a conditional, which will then churn out into an output. So, this is extremely important because in the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to have discussions about AI rights.
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins already speaking about AI rights. Speaking about giving rights to our robots. So the robot is just an input-output machine. It does not have intentionality. And this is mentioned in the philosophy of mind, it's mentioned and so on. And so these discussions will have practical implications. But this intentionality is one aspect of what? Consciousness. Because consciousness is first-person subjective experience. Right? So if even something which can be assessed here, which is communicative intentionality, can be seen as differentiated between robots and human beings because of the systems, the intrinsic and autonomous systems that exist in one that don't in the other, then clearly we can make further analogies to that effect when it comes to human beings and their differences with robots and so on. So today there's lots of this. I don't want to be information overload. I can see the faces, come gloomy and stuff, but let's just kind of summarize. How long was it? 47 minutes. Okay. Let's summarize. To summarize, therefore, today we've spoken about materialism and naturalism. Naturalism we've subcompartmentalized into methodological naturalism, which we said is what you do when you do science, for example, or you can even say philosophy, as David Papanier mentions. But it's basically the assumption. You don't assume God exists when you do scientific experiments. You don't assume that. You don't put that into the assumption of your method. So this is a methodological approach, which is differentiated between or from ontological or metaphysical naturalism, which is a claim about the world and how it doesn't have any supernatural forces operating within it. This claim is similar to the claim that materialist makes, if not the same, which is interchangeable with the word physicalist. So these two terms in the philosophy of mind are used interchangeably for all intents and purposes. We talked about materialism, and we talked about the different strands of materialism: emergent materialism, reductive materialism, functionalism, and so on. And we defined some of those things, but they'll require a little bit further reading from you guys, so as not to descope this session and so on. And then we talked about logical positivism and empiricism, and how they are different from one another, but once again they're similar. We talked about the thing that makes them different from materialists, namely the verification principle, which was the cause of their demise, really, in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. And then we spoke about substance theory and how that's divided from materialism and dualism and idealism. And idealism and materialism are two opposite things. Idealism says everything is in the mind. George Berkeley and so on, these individuals say that. Whereas materialism says everything is physical, so it's completely opposite. And dualism is in the middle somewhere. And one of the major proponents in the West, at least, for that is René Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am, therefore," thereby differentiating mind and body. And then we spoke about some of the arguments against materialism. Some of the arguments against materialism being, number one, we mentioned that materialism is at least any scientific inquiry is third person. And so to try and use science to disprove or to undercut dualism is impossible by virtue of the fact that consciousness is defined as a first-person subjective experience and it's untappable by third-person science. So it's untappable. It's for someone to say, like with emergent materialists, with functionalists and all these people, they're saying that we're going to find out later. Well, you can never find out because you have a system that deals with third-person stuff, and this is a first-person thing. So these things are not, this is the first argument. Then we talked about the replacement and rejuvenation of cells and how that's, if we change the planks of a ship one by one, will it be the same ship? It won't be the same ship. Therefore, the thing, if it's all material, the same thing applies with the human being. If we're all material, then there's no place for the soul, there's no place for any of these things, then we should be the same person. But 10 years, all our cells will be replenished, and therefore we should be different people. Give us a new passport. And so on. Give us a new name. Maybe someone should name us something else. If I go to court, maybe the judge should say, it was you 10 years ago, it's a different person materially, if he's a materialist, and so on. So the absurdities will start to arise. The third thing we talked about, after that, we said robots and AI, all right, good. So we talked about intentionality and how William Hasker's experiment and stuff like that, the difference between syntax and semantics, and how syntax is what you say, whereas semantics is what you say and what you mean. Pardon?
What's the name?
I'll send you all the references. I'll send you. William Hasker. Yeah. And the Chinese room experiment is by John Searle, okay, where he talks about, the final and last thing we're going to mention today, okay, because it's obviously in the poem and very important. The final and last thing, so we've had kind of like an overview of materialism, naturalism, positivism. So all these isms today, right? Well, maybe 20 isms, I don't know how many, 10 isms we went through today, right? But today I want you to just think about one thing. If you are a materialist, what access do you have, okay, to morality? You can't put morality under a microscope in any way, shape, or form. In fact, for a logical positivist, morality is a meaningless thing. Remember, they say that anything that cannot be seen as empirically justifiable through the verification principle is something which is meaningless. So how can someone who's like Bertrand Russell, for example, an atheist and so on, He was a little bit more consistent than the Richard Dawkins, this individual, who's a naturalist by admission. And he admits there's no such thing as good and bad, it's all pitiless indifference and so on. But then he starts attacking Islam and Christianity, all these religions, on moral ground. My question is, how dare you? It's not even how could you, it's how dare you? Because you have no basis for this. In fact, on your worldview, this is meaningless. Morality is not even something which, it's a meaningless thing. Because it's a priori. It's what we're talking about. Expressionist morality, what we're talking about. Any morality you want to bring forward is meaningless for a positivist. If not a materialist, it's unsubstantiated. For materialists now, they can have a subjective morality. Of course. They can have a materialist can have a subjective morality, no problems. But how can you verify it in a physicalist format, in a materialist format? How can it be as real to you as the physical processes that are happening in the world? And if it can't be as real to you as the physical processes that are happening in the world, if it can't be as real to you as these things, then in that case, we may say they are not. And so in the poem, he mentions that, and we mentioned this phrase because I think it's very powerful. I think the first person that I heard is actually Imran Hussein, from Ayura. I loved it when he said this. We went to Queen Mary, this was a long time, 4 years ago, and I just stuck in my head. And he said it, it's just beautiful. And he said that, I was walking, he was talking about his own existential experiences, and he said, I was walking in the street or something like that. And he was like suffering from like atheist doubts, whatever. He was saying nihilism and all those kind of things. And he said, I looked at the butcher shop and I saw a slab of meat. And he said, on this worldview, me and the slab of meat are the same. Actually, because we're composed of the same physical things, right? So if you slice, and I used more crude examples of some very rude person in the park. He came to me and said, actually, when I went to the toilet and I flushed my feces down the toilet, that feces is equivalent to you. Actually, it's called a carbon-based thing. You are nothing. You are nothing. This is the situation. You are just a rearrangement, we say, of atoms. It's a beautiful way of putting it. Imagine a plane filled with hundreds of people, and it just crashes into another plane, and all the kids die, and everything. It's just a rearrangement of atoms and carbon.
So according to them, human life has no meaning.
There's no meaning that can be extrapolated on physicalist grounds. We'll put it in that language, right? On their worldview, like if we're talking about materialism, right? How can you jump from everything that is meaningful, or if not meaningful, anything can be explained through physicalism, but you can't explain morality like that. And you can't bring about an objective morality with that. So I'm saying that if you are a materialist, or a physicalist, or a metaphysical naturalist, any of those categories, you cannot bring about a higher order morality now, without it being completely illusory. It's completely illusory. Remember, they say that consciousness, a lot of them will actually say that consciousness is illusory. They will say this. They will write this. This is what they've written. I haven't said that myself. Folk psychology, they call it Chambers or whatever, David Chambers. If it's illusory, then so is morality illusory. Because everything that comes from a conscious or a priori kind of base must be also the same thing. It must be illusory. So morality is illusory. How dare you talk to us about morality? How dare you? And this is really, academically this is well known. But on a popular level, they're allowed to do whatever they want. Because no one can say that. It's such a simple argument. Everyone can know it. If they commit themselves to metaphysical materialism or naturalism, especially those things, okay? Metaphysical, materialism, naturalism, physicalism, any of those, if they commit themselves to that, you should be getting excited because they cannot say anything moral. In fact, you should attack them morally. So what do you think of this rape and this? Think of the most gruesome thing you can think of. They cannot say anything about that. They'd have to make a subjective case based on a priori grounds, which, once again, a priori, physicalism, they don't even come together, unfortunately. If everything can be explained through physical processes, which is the claim. They can say all of that. That's what they do. In fact, that's what Sam Harris, consequentialism, and we will be going through each of those moral things. We're going to be going through consequentialism, deontological ethics, liberalism, social liberalism, all of those things we are going to go through one by one. Feminism, all of those things, isms, all of those moral philosophies and political philosophy, we're going to go through one by one. Okay, and we'll have to, they'll have their own separate treatment, every single one of them. But the point I'm making to you is this, is that if you're a materialist, all of this doesn't matter. Because if you say I'm a materialist feminist, materialist liberal, you try and put it together, you're going to require a priori ontological distinctions in order to make your argument. And we're going to come to that. Which means they're not physical stuff. You can't put it under a microscope. This phrase, you cannot put this morality that you're talking about under a microscope. Just remember that phrase. You cannot put it. It's not reduced to physical stuff. Where is it? Can I smell it? Can I see it? Where's the morality? Let me smell it. Let me see it. Let me taste it. You know? Let me hear it. Let it tap one of my five senses. Otherwise, it doesn't meet your criterion. Otherwise, it can't be physical. And if it's not physical, then what is it? An illusion, right? So if it's an illusion, why are we talking about illusory stuff? Morality for you is an illusion. So I'm not here to talk about hallucinations and illusions. Delusions. The morality delusion. That's what he should have wrote. Instead of the God delusion, he wrote the morality delusion. And he would have refuted himself in more than 400 pages. Because all of his arguments are moral arguments. Why the God delusion? Why not the morality delusion? If both in the same a priori category, God and morality are the same category. They're untappable by the five senses. So why not the morality delusion? Tell me why not. Any questions? Okay. No, this is, I think, all that we need to say about it. So to summarize, therefore, we talked about the distinctions of naturalism and materialism and physicalism and different types of physicalism, different kinds of materialism. We talked about the hard problem of consciousness. We talked about AI. We talked about intentionality, syntax, semantics. We talked about morality at the end. And with this, hopefully this lesson will be instrumental because it will allow you to deal with not just atheists, but atheists that are committed to these camps, if you like, or schools of thought. And hopefully, inshallah, when we're progressing to other things, this is always going to be a supplementary argument they're going to use. Like if you're dealing with a feminist, you're going to use the materialist argument. If you're dealing with an atheist feminist kind of materialist, you have to address this point. It's the undercutter. Because every single morality that we're going to go through today is going to rely upon some a priori understanding of morality. And hopefully you benefited at home. وجزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.